bucka. Haha. You know the deal.
The next thing we're going to talk about in our percent unit is what's called sales tax. And sales tax is essentially a fee that's charged on top of a purchase that you make, usually items that you buy. And there is a fee charged on top of those goods and services. And that fee depends on where you are in the world. Here in Ontario, we pay a couple of taxes on our goods and services. We pay one tax that's called the provincial tax, and another one that's called the GST, which is our federal tax. And a couple of years ago, those were combined into one tax, which is now called the harmonized sales tax, or HST. So the provincial sales tax and the federal sales tax, called the goods and services tax, or the GST, they've varied over the years. At this point now, in Ontario, we pay a provincial sales tax of 8%. And the current GST, goods and services tax, in Canada from the federal government is 5%. So a couple of years ago, as I mentioned, the provincial government of Ontario decided to harmonize these taxes. These taxes used to be charged separately. So if you have an older textbook in Ontario, you might find there are questions that ask you to calculate the provincial sales tax and the federal sales tax, the GST, separately. And that's the way that it used to be charged in Ontario, but now it's charged as one tax. They just simply added these two taxes together and made it 13%. So currently, the purchases that you make in Ontario, for the most part, have the harmonized sales tax on them. So when we're calculating how much tax we pay on a good or a service, it's 13% of whatever the cost of the item is. So if we're going to translate that into a math sentence, I'm going to use a little bit of algebra here to translate this sentence into a math sentence, because we have this word here, cost. So if I have to translate that, well, the cost will vary depending on what we buy. If we buy a car, it costs a certain amount. If we buy an apple, it costs another amount. So the cost does vary from one item to the next. So I'm going to assign a variable to that. Now, in our algebra unit, we talked about using let statements. I would write something along the lines of let x represent the cost. This word of translates to multiply, but since I've used the symbol x for times, I want to try to stay away from using that symbol x for multiplying. So I'm just going to leave that one for now. In the previous videos, when we talked about calculating the percent of a number, we know that we have to change the percent to a decimal. That's one way to calculate a percent. And 13% written as a decimal is 0.13. And as we talked about in the algebra videos, when we're multiplying a number times a variable, we usually just put the letter next to the number, like this. This means 0.13 times x. And so that's how we calculate tax on an item, on a good or a service that we purchase. We multiply 0.13 times the cost of that purchase. So here's a typical question that you might be faced with when you're dealing with calculating tax. And once again, here we have a very practical application of using percent. So if you go into a store and a shirt costs $19.99, well, the question you might ask yourself is, what is the tax on that shirt, and what is the total cost? As we just discussed, to calculate tax on an item, it's 13% of the cost. And in this case, the cost is $19.99, so it's 13% of $19.99. And as we also discussed, to calculate the percent of a number, we want to change that sentence to a math sentence. So one way to do that is to change the percent to a decimal. of changes to multiply, and 1999 is already a number, so it stays as 1999, $19.99. Well, here we can see having a calculator can come in handy for this type of question. You might be able to estimate what 13% of $19.99 is, but if we use our calculator and you multiply 0.13 times 19.99, you get 2.5987. Now, since we're dealing with money here, we can only use the place values that make sense for money. And the place value that makes sense for money is anything bigger than the ones, but in terms of to the right of the decimal, we only deal with the tenths and the hundredths. The hundredths in money are cents. So what we're going to do here is round to the nearest cent. So we have to look to the first place to the right. That's an 8 there, which means we're going to round up. So if we round that up to the nearest cent, it's $2.60. which, if we're dealing with money, we would write as 2.60. So there's your tax on your shirt. When we've rounded it to the nearest cent, it rounds to $2.60. So to calculate the total cost, we have to take the original price, which is $19.99, and add the tax. So our tax was $2.60. So the total purchase price here is $22.59. So there we've calculated how much this shirt will cost when we go to pay for it after taxes. We started by calculating the tax, which was 13% of the original number, of the original cost here, which is 19.99. And then we got the total cost by adding the tax to the original cost. So we found the tax was $2.60. We added that to $19.99 for a total cost of $22.59 for this shirt. So here's another example of a question involving calculating tax and calculating the total cost. So here we have a television that costs $300. And the first question is, what is the tax? And the second question is, what is the total cost? Well, with the previous example, I multiplied 0.13 times the original cost to calculate 13% of $300. I'm going to use equivalent ratios to figure out the answer to this question. So since the tax is 13%, what that means is for every $100, it's going to be $13. So we have a ratio of $13 for every $100, because 13% of 100 is 13. So here our cost is $300. Well, if we're going to use our equivalent ratios here, the second number represents the cost, so we need to make that 300. And if we're writing equivalent ratios here to change 100 to 300, we have to multiply it by 3. So if that's what we do to 100, that's also what we have to do to 13. And what we find is that the tax here is $39. So as you can see, you don't always have to multiply 0.13 times the cost. You can use equivalent ratios as well. In this case, it was easier to use equivalent ratios because we had a nice round even number that 100 went evenly into. If you did multiply 0.13 times 300, you would find that it's 39. So that method always works. But sometimes for practical purposes, we can calculate what the tax is using equivalent ratios. And if we do that here, or if we do 0.13 times 300, we find that the tax is $39. Well, the total cost is the original cost, which was $300, plus the tax, which is $39. So for this television, including tax, it's going to cost $339. Here's another example where we're wanting to just get the total cost. Most of the time when we're going to purchase something, we don't really need to know necessarily what the tax is going to be. All we're really interested in knowing is, well, what is the final price? And so that's what's being asked here. What is the total cost, including tax, for a fridge that costs $1,299.99? Well, as we saw with the previous examples, to calculate total cost, we take the original price and we add the tax that's being put on top. And to calculate the tax, usually the way we calculate the tax is 13% of the original cost. So to calculate the total price, the total cost, we take the original price plus 13% of the original price. If I want to write this English sentence as a math sentence, I'm going to have to use some algebra here. And I've got a piece of information here that varies, which is the original price. It's written twice here in this sentence. So again, normally if I'm going to translate this, I would write something along the lines of let X represent the original price. So if that's going to be the case, instead of writing original price, I'll write X. Next we have plus, which we translate into adding. And then we've got 13% of the original price. And as we talked about before, to calculate that, it's 0.13 times X. Now I can use the same variable here because it is the same piece of information. Here we're talking about the original price, and here we're talking about the original price in this English sentence. So I can use the same variable. Well, as we talked about in the video on algebra, what we've got in this math sentence are what are called like terms. And when I just have an x, that's the same as 1x. And since these are like terms, since the variables are exactly the same, we can add these like terms together. And when we do that, 1 plus 0.13 is 1.13. So here we have an expression for the total cost. To calculate the total cost, if I don't need to know just what the tax is, I just want to get right to the total cost, we can take the original price and multiply it by 1.13. So in this case, our original price is $1,299.99. So that's my value for X here. So to calculate the total cost, we multiply 1.13 times $1,299.99. And when I use my calculator to do that, I get this number, 1,468.9887. Well, once again here, we're dealing with money. And when we're dealing with money, we always have to round to the nearest hundredth. So when we're rounding, we always look to the first place to the right. Here I have an 8, so we round up to the nearest cent. The next cent going up is $1,468.99. which is the total cost for this fridge. How much did we pay in tax? Well, I don't really know. We could figure it out by subtracting the original cost minus 1,468.99. But the fact is we weren't asked for the tax in this question. We were only asked for the final price. And for practical purposes, most of the time, that's what you're interested in finding out, is the final price. And if all you need to know is the final price, you can multiply 1.13 times the original price to calculate the total price in Ontario, where we pay 13% sales tax on our goods and services. So to finish off our lesson on sales tax, I'm going to ask you to calculate a couple of things here. So for question number 1, for each of those 3 prices, you're being asked for both the sales tax and the final price. So for each question there in number 1, A, B, and C, there are 2 answers for each question. How much is the tax in Ontario at 13%, and what is the final price? For question number 2, just being asked for the final price. So you have your original price, and what is the final price after 13% tax is added for our tax rate in Ontario. And you can use any of the methods that were discussed in the video to calculate the answers for each of these. If you're able to do that, congratulations, you now have a firm understanding of how to calculate sales tax and final price.